Hello and welcome to today's Interspecies Conversation lecture. My name is Cristian Hernandez-Blick, the head of programming here at Interspecies Internet, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the trustees and the organization. This talk is part of a regular online lecture and workshop series titled Interspecies Conversations, which invites leading professors, scientists, researchers, and students to share work that contributes to advancing our understanding of the diversity, forms, and functions of communication in other species, as well as adjacent topics related to non-human animal cognition, behavior, and welfare. We aim to showcase emerging ideas and discoveries and host open discussions where our community can join the conversation with ideas and feedback. So today's talk will be delivered by Melanie Challenger. Melanie is a writer, researcher, and bioethicist, deputy co-chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and co-director of CIRCE and Animals in the Room. She writes and broadcasts on environmental history, the philosophy and history of science, and the relationship of humans to the living world. Melanie has authored and edited numerous books, including How to Be Animal, A New History of What It Means to Be Human, published in 2021 by a Penguin Random House, and Animal Dignity, Philosophical Reflections on Non-Human Existence, published in 2023 by Bloomsbury. In her talk today, Melanie will introduce a new international project based at New York University, which aims to study, design, and evaluate how we communicate with other species, take their perspectives, represent their interests, and include them in our decisions to help shape a fairer and more compassionate world. So Melanie, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, and over to you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming. It's lovely to see everybody and see all the amazing places that you're sitting in and living in at the minute. I have to thank obviously Kate and Caro and Cristian for inviting me. I'm really, really happy to be here. I'm just going to share my screen with you guys. I have to say, I've just recovered, just out the other side of a sort of multi-pathogen experience of having COVID and flu simultaneously that ended in pneumonia. So I'm just sort of coming out the other side of it. I might not be my absolute sharpest, but I'm going to do my very best for you. And I'm really delighted to, this is my first public talk since I was poorly. So it's really, really lovely to be here. I'm going to be doing a talk about co-creating coexistence. So we'll sort of elaborate on that. But really, this is a kind of, you're a special sort of first audience for us, because our project that we've been working on is still, we're very close, but we're still in the sort of dream and sort of vision stage of what we're doing. We're going to be launching a little later this year. Work is underway, but the sort of we've been going on quite a journey for the last few years. So it's really special to be able to share it with you today. It's new, it's experimental, and so I'm really excited to get your feedback on it. First of all, I will probably just explain myself a little further, because I have a unusual background into this, and I didn't really anticipate that I would end up doing this. That may resonate with some people. I think that's not unusual, but yeah, my journey through to this has been, I couldn't have predicted it. However many years ago, I was always passionate about the living world, passionate about other animals, and broadly just interested in natural history right from the beginning. But I wanted to be a writer. I am a writer. That's where I come from in my core. And I came out of the creative arts. So I studied English literature and language at Oxford. And then I started initially as a writer, and also actually across classical music, and I still work in those areas. So right now, aside from this work that I'm doing, I'm working on a large opera commission, main stage opera commission, with my collaborator Mark Simpson, who's one of the UK's finest musicians and composers. So I have this kind of completely creative life, and that was where I came from. Right from the very beginning, I was always asking questions about our relationship to the environment, our relationship to the rest of nature, what kind of creature we are. And I couldn't always quite get, possibly too young, lack of skill, I don't know. I couldn't quite bend my art to answer the sorts of questions that I wanted to answer. And that was how I moved into what is, my main work really today, which is writing and broadcasting, very much in mainstream, on intellectual history about our relationship to other species and the rest of the living world. Through that work, I became, which a lot of which is working with scientists very closely. I've done that for many, many years, and spending time in the wild, in nature, with other creatures. And through that work, I became, I don't want to say radicalized, but I became alarmed, and I became very concerned about getting the kind of ethical and moral dimensions right. That led me into bioethics. And I actually intended originally, I was asking bioethical questions, so about frontier technologies. I say this to people who are working in technology today. How do we get governance right with technologies? How do we get the underlying concepts and ethical frames right when we're dealing with disruptive and exciting technologies and advances, particularly with relation to biology, with relation to life sciences more broadly? Because I was always asking questions about what nature is, right? How we define intelligence, these sorts of very broad questions, that was what led me into that area. And it was through that work. And so you can see how these kind of little connections, if you're following a sort of intellectual, inquiry through life, these things build out to another area of another dimension of work, another sort of space, professional space. Through that work, I spent 2 years on the subgroup for a genome editing farmed animals project for a UK sort of a government-facing piece of work. Really rigorous, really good. I worked with John Dupree, really philosopher of biology, and others on that project. But it was very difficult to get the right ethical tools for that. And what struck me, and it wasn't the fault of our process, and it doesn't render it invalid, it did strike me that we didn't hear from the animals. We didn't include them. We didn't have the right infrastructure to include their voices. And that was the seed of what has come on with Circe, what I'm going to introduce you to today. And with that, I became convinced that we needed to find the right kind of way to recognize that other living beings can define their own interests, not in the way we might term define, but they can generate their own interests. They're autonomous beings. They can certainly communicate their interests to us, and we're pretty good at knowing what they want. And yet we have no way to bring their voices in a really meaningful, substantial way into our governance and decision-making processes at the moment. And I really felt it in that genome editing project. So this was just before the pandemic. I reached out to the people who were in the scholarly community, who I felt were doing different important parts of the kind of way you might start to answer that question, different from different disciplines. So within our team, initially we had a really large group of us actually from lots of different disciplines, and we slowly got down to a core steering group, and we've been working together now for about 3 years thinking about inclusion and representation. So we called the project originally Animals Jury, based on the kind of bizarre animal trials and juries of the past, and a modern take on it. But we expanded out from that to looking at inclusion and representation more broadly of non-human beings in a wide range of decision-making arena. And our core group are made up of people from different disciplines around the world, but who have contributed already original ideas and thoughts in these kind of areas. So we have people like Danielle Sellermeyer, who runs the Multispecies Justice Project at Sydney University and is a political scientist. Also in the kind of political philosophy, political science arena, we have Alistair Cochrane at Sheffield University. We have Alfonso Donoso in Chile, in Santiago. We have in animal welfare and ethics, we have Julius Kapembwa, who's at University of Zambia and works more on what animal ethics looks like from an African perspective. We have Dan Weary at UBC in Canada, pioneer of animal welfare studies. And we have Erin Ryan, my co-director, and Becca Franks, who works on animal behaviour and motivations and preferences, and Lucy Parry, who is a democratic innovation specialist. So we come from quite a lot of different disciplines, and our wider group is made up of scientists across communication, bioacoustics, all kinds of different areas that pertain to other living beings and their intelligence, their communication, and their well-being. So we turn from animals jury into animals in the room, and animals in the room is going to crop up a bit later, but animals in the room has now been subsumed into a larger project to set up a centre, the first centre to study and evaluate the democratic inclusion, or the inclusion of other voices of other living beings in a really wide range of decision-making contexts. And so we're calling it Circe after the goddess who somewhat maligned through ancient history, but was able to transform herself and others into animals and to speak to the rest of the living world. And it stands for Centre for the Inclusion and Representation towards Coexistence. That not clicking through. Has that frozen? Oh, there we go. So even though we kind of haven't hard launched into the world at the moment, we've been doing work around this. We were selected for the Asia Government project at the World Government Summit in Dubai and have been featured in a range of different media. And that's been really exciting. It's why it's great to do these things, because what we want at the moment is we're in that kind of real stage of institution building, of project development and getting feedback. And what we really want is partners, of course, people who are one part of this puzzle, who want to collaborate, who want to experiment, who are excited by these sorts of ideas. So we're in a kind of real public engagement drive at the moment. I'm just going to introduce you to my colleague, Erin Ryan, who co-directs the kind of broader project with me. And this is her in Dubai in 2024.
I came to Dubai to talk about this project as one of the edges of future governance, and it connects to the broader projects here because we're facing unprecedented challenges in our world today that are requiring us to really think outside of the box. And this project specifically is looking to broaden the conversation and to really expand who we think deserves to be part of our conversations.
So what's our vision? So our vision is to include animals and nature in the decisions that matter. And we are looking very, very widely. Our focus is just on animals. But because a number of our group are very focused on multi-species work, we realised quite quickly, and of course animals are embedded in their wider ecologies, that it was sensible to look at inclusion and representation in aggregate forms, so where we're including nature, for instance, and also to keep that focus also on individual animals or individual communities of animals. So we will be looking at both kinds of inclusion and representation at the centre. And it comes from a principle of inclusion. So this is Danielle Sellermeyer. She says here, procedural justice requires that in a democratic community, everybody that's going to be affected by a law or principle, the order of principle, has to be included in the construction of that law, however we are instituting that. And obviously you can replace law for governance, for whatever you want to. The principle of inclusion holds. Now, we have several core principles that are driving our work. One of them is that animals are agents, that other living beings have agency very widely in nature, and also that they can communicate. So they can develop their own interests, they can communicate their own interests to us. And so we have a belief that's at the heart of this, that we should be including their voices on that basis. We're not necessarily a rights-based approach, but you can see that there's complementary elements to that, but we can talk about that a little bit later. But our approach is probably closer in some ways to relational justice, to the idea that we need to look at our systems, the way in which we make decisions, and make them more equitable and more appropriate to other living beings as community members within our world. So our centre at NYU is going to, even though it's at NYU, I should say that we are partnering with institutions around the world. So it's very much a global project, a kind of hub and spokes approach. But NYU have been kind enough to offer us a home. So that's why we're basing ourselves there. And we're going to have three fundamental dimensions to our work. First, and really crucial one, is the academic one. So for that, we have to look at all of the aspects of inclusion and representation, but we need to make sure everything is really evidence-based. And so we're not going to be about quick answers. We're going to be about very carefully studying all of the different aspects and dimensions that we might need to think about, and slowly working towards evidence-based frameworks for inclusion, for instance. And within that academic focus, we're going to allow that to be really quite experimental. So we'll have lots of different orientation and different possibilities and ideas being worked through. The other very crucial component of the work that we'll be doing is the policy work. So we are going to be designing and facilitating, in some cases, certainly collaborating with others on real world inclusion pilots. So we need to see how this really plays out in real contexts and learn from those in quite an experimental way. And also, you know, the point is, this is not just about ideas. This is not about the abstract. We're moving from the abstract. Lots of people have been talking about inclusion for a long time, actually. But we're moving beyond the abstract into really doing this in the real world and seeing what difference that it makes. And then the other part, a stream that we'll have there, is looking at arts and technology. And I'll go into this a little bit more later, but it became very clear to us early on that some of the really pioneering voices in multi-species listening and communicating actually come from the arts. So that's a really important experimentation site at the moment, not just with human imagination, but also just artists out there trying to co-create work and co-design work with other living beings. They're a very important source of knowledge and inspiration, and may well be very important to how, in fact, we do inclusion successfully. And likewise, of course, as Interspecies Internet will no doubt back me up on, technology is also a very important part of this. It's important in terms of how we understand what other living beings want. That's going to be a key part. Could we communicate with them directly and have a greater sort of a more immediate form of representation? We don't know. We can talk about that today, but certainly technology is an important part of the dimension here, as is inclusion in how technology is created and how technology is disseminated. I think that a lot about AI, this concerns me all the time, not perhaps in the ways that we've currently been thinking about AI, actually, but in my own work, in my research for How to Be Animal, for instance, I looked a lot at anthropomorphism and dehumanization. So aspects of how our social cognition look for agents, assess and respond to intelligence. And I'm aware, you know, as are many other people who work in these kinds of fields, that human beings are very flexible about their agent detection and also their inference of intelligence and mind and agency. And we're also very hierarchical about it. So we can block signals of intelligence and mind from when it's convenient or it's necessary to us, and we can also get overzealous and sort of amplify the intelligence that we infer that another has when it suits us. And I worry about what synthetic forms of intelligence will do to that aspect of our social cognition, and I don't hear that in the conversations enough. So lots of areas that we can look at arts and technology from a multi-species inclusive perspective. So our mission in the academic sense now is these are the kind of really, there's more to it than to the program than this, but these are the three probably main domains. The first is to look at inclusive practices for communicating with other species. So if we're going to include and represent the interests of other living beings, we're making a knowledge claim about them. And we also have to get that knowledge from somewhere. Most wild animals, for instance, are usually going in the opposite direction to a human, and they're certainly not trying to engage and let you know what their notion of good is in flourishing in that moment. So we rely on sometimes very intrusive forms of and disenfranchising forms of knowledge capture in order to understand the preferences and interests and behaviours of other living beings. So what does inclusive science look like is a crucial part of the picture, but how do we do it? How do we do it well? How do we trust those, the knowledge that we gain? And how do we translate that? How do we interpret the results? Are we interpreting the results in too anthropocentric a way, for instance, and so forth? So a big area of our research, and Becca Franks will probably lead on a lot of this kind of work. These are questions she's very concerned with, and others in her lab. We'll be looking very much at how we get that knowledge part right, how we do the science well, how we communicate well. Then we need to look at how to represent non-human voices effectively. We just don't know. I've said this a number of times when I've been talking about the project, but we've been experimenting with human democracy for more than 2,000 years, and we're still struggling to get representation right for human beings. We still have marginalized voices. We still have problems with whose knowledge we think is more or less important, and all of these kinds of, and as well as simply just still trialing democracy. Deliberative democracy has seen a real flourishing recently, and that's because we are trying to get democratic tools and systems to work more effectively for modern society, and to have them express the kind of goals of justice and fairness. So we don't know, and I don't think there's anyone on this earth who knows really absolutely how best to include and represent at the moment, and that's why we need to study it. We need to understand, and we need to understand in different cultures, with different kinds of organisms, in different kinds of dilemmas, with different levels of conflict and so forth. We need to do that experimentally and trust and be willing to experiment. And then, of course, we need to evaluate what a good outcome looks like, who determines what a good outcome is from this, and how do we evaluate inclusion and the success for other living beings. We can't determine in advance in a process, for instance, that the outcome will necessarily go the way that we hope it might for a particular community of organisms. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't be heard, for starters, but it's also about really trying to understand where the roadblocks might be for bringing the voices of other beings into decision-making environments. And that's why this is kind of an important piece of the academic puzzle. This is an area my colleague Erin Ryan has pioneered quite a lot of work in this area. So perspective taking, there's some good psych studies around perspective taking with human beings. We know, for instance, that perspective taking is more effective when we properly imagine ourselves as another rather than imagining ourselves in their shoes. We know that perspective taking processes or interventions can be really positive for creating like useful outcomes rather than just sort of novel outcomes, and it seems to support very creative forms of problem solving. This is in human domains, but we're seeing the way that perspective taking intersects with our kind of flexible social cognition. So what does it look like for human beings? Well, in Erin's work, for instance, she hasn't actually published this yet, so I can't give too much information on it, but in Erin's work, she's found a number of moments in a perspective taking process with other living beings. In this case, she was working with cows and with dairy cows, and taking the perspectives of the cows in industrial contexts, that there are a number of moments where human participants struggle to take the perspectives of other living beings. So why this is a crucial little area to study, and I'm highlighting it, is because we can't just assume that, for instance, if we could communicate directly with other living beings, which we do, but let's, working in a more technologized context, that we would hear them and attend to them fairly. And we can't assume that if we were to include and represent them, that we would attend to living beings in a fair way. We, in fact, I think, should hypothesize and assume that we can't and won't, certainly in a very anthropocentric world. So a critical part of the puzzle is, how does perspective taking before representational communication have an impact? And is that an important part that we need to sort of get right and to assist us in biases? And then, of course, there are the sort of getting into the details of different representational or inclusive models. There are like a ton of these at the moment. It's a really exciting space, and we're hoping to partner with as many people who are across this space as possible. So we have broadly, we're on an innovation wave with democracy at the moment and democratic innovation. So that's one area we can look at. So things like deliberations, community dialogues, and citizens' juries. There are also more sort of business context and industry context models like board representation, for instance, like Faith and the Nature have nature on the board. We have multi-species stakeholder engagement processes. So there are a lot of different ways. There's kind of councils of all beings. There are a number of different kinds of models, and within that also lots of different ways of facilitating, because all facilitation isn't born equal. So different methodologies, different approaches. And actually, if we're going to get this right, and we're going to understand why it might work in one context and not in another, why it might land in one culture and not effectively in another, or with certain kinds of organisms and not others, we need to really experiment quite widely, and we need to be evaluating across all of them. So some of the work we'll be doing will be partnering with people who are doing this in really small to kind of really large scale ways, and tying in with people in earth governance systems context, for instance, in charities and NGOs, and partnering with them to evaluate their processes and have them all be part of a large database where we can start, to go from probably very coarse-grained data at first and getting closer, getting more fine-grained detail as we go on. So how does it change people's perspectives? What kind of outcomes come from them? How do you frame things and get the right kind of lens at the outset? And what sorts of things can skew the process? So all of that kind of, those sorts of questions we'll be asking and studying, and they all come under the kind of representation and inclusion models. I spoke to you about the arts, so this is something I'm really excited about. So one of the things that we're going to be setting up in CSE is the Multispecies Collab. And this is a network. We've already held a large workshop with about 50 participants, but I envisage it being quite a bit larger actually, and global. So But we worked with artists initially to envision with them what a really effective integration of the arts into our project would look like. And we arrived at a network of emerging and really established artists who are working in different practices, but as multi-species oriented in some way or another. Some of them are co-creating work with other animals. Some of them are doing VR and immersive work. Some of them are reflecting on the problem and critiquing the problem of animals, of other living beings, of nature, and so forth. But what we were doing is bringing a global community together who are working. They can support one another. They can learn from one another. What we'll be doing is understanding how arts methods can be a crucial part of this puzzle. Understand how arts, how embodiment, for instance, affect our ability to take perspectives and include and to communicate. What aspects of communication are missed when we just focus on vocalization or verbal communication or written communication. What other forms of engagement we can recruit, and when does embodiment, for instance, or immersion, or these kinds of arts approaches, when in the process or intervention is it crucial, or is it helpful, and so forth. And how do arts change social values? What impact can they have? And we'll be feeding into our artists the kinds of projects that we have on the horizon, and sort of pulling out people at different moments to get involved. So if anyone is an artist in this area, please get in touch. We're wide open to expanding that community. And then finally, the policy dimension, and this is where Animals in the Room, our original starting place, has landed alongside. We're going to have nature in the room as well, so looking more at kind of broader nature representation. So, but I'm going to focus on Animals in the Room. So we have a number of projects. I can't give massive detail about some of them, but most of them are underway. Conversations have been going on for quite some time, and several of them are launching this autumn. So one of the projects we've been talking about has been dealing with coexistence and conflict with savanna and forest elephants in Africa. And I've been talking to the wonderful Joyce Poole for quite some time, and other members of her research team and her partners and associates, as well as the Cornell team in the Elephant Listening Project, about the possibility of designing community dialogues around coexistence. And so the problem that we have there is that there's lots of actors on the ground at different levels of decision making and the infrastructure around the conflict with elephants, and yet, despite people being in this area and working on this for kind of 30 years, these are still intractable dilemmas. And anybody who works in conflict, human-wildlife conflict and coexistence, knows that we have greater conflict on the horizon than ever before. Social tolerance for certainly competing organisms, particularly large cats, for instance, bears, wolves, zero tolerance for wolves, but social tolerance, golden jackals, there are lots, and it often is mammals, it's often large mammals, it's mammals who compete with us directly. We have very low social tolerance from, and in certain places it's now trending down, conflicts are increasing. So there is a mandate for our work, and this is something really crucial for the work that we're trying to do in policy. We want a mandate to be there, that there needs to be a justification for trying something new when we've thrown a lot of tools at the problem and we need something fresh. And what I'm hearing from very exhausted and frustrated colleagues who've been in conservation for a long time is that they want new tools. And perspective taking with and inclusion of the voices in a meaningful, substantial way of other living beings, of the animals that they're working with, is something we can trial. It's something that we can measure. So we can understand, for instance, through a process like this, how perspective taking and communication and inclusion of the voices of elephants impacts social tolerance or tolerance for coexistence. We can go further in certain circumstances. I don't know if we will with these yet, but we can get communities to then deliberate, hopefully towards new and novel approaches to coexistence. We know from deliberation with humans that these kinds of multi-stakeholder engagement processes are very positive if done well, in terms of allowing the human community, who are often disenfranchised as well, to feel like they can trust a conservation process or initiative, for instance, or have greater trust for the authorities who are engaged. So that's the kind of work that we're looking at with elephants, and it's quite close to some parallel work that we're doing with bears. So this is a project that will probably be our first inclusion project to get going. We're working with a fantastic group of facilitators called La Prossima Cultura in Italy, and we're working on dialogues with bears. So an intervention and a community dialogue that will meaningfully include the voices and interests of bears as stakeholders around resistance with bears and conflicts with bears, human conflicts with European brown bears in Italy. We have, this really came out of conversations with NGOs like Four Paws International, who were facing novel and challenges. So because conflicts are rising actually with bears right across Europe, and the management plan with these kinds of animals is under scrutiny, there's been more and more pressure to take quote unquote problem bears and put them into sanctuaries. The problem for facing a group like Four Paws International, who provide sanctuaries for bears that have been in circuses, for instance, or been in captivity in some way or another, is that they are used to habituated bears who often do well when they're in a poorer welfare and enriched environment in captivity. But we know that wild bears do not thrive when they're taken and placed into captivity. So there are a lot of challenges. They know that if they say no to taking bears, then the bears will probably be shot. But equally well, they know that if they take them, it's not necessarily in the interests of the bears. So there is an urgency, again, to try something new, to work with a different kind of orientation, not only because bears deserve to be there, going back to that principle of inclusion, we should hear their voices and represent their voices, even if it doesn't go their way in a process. So there's a principle here, and a philosophical principle and a political principle here, but also just in straightforward terms, because we need some new methods to try. We need to work on getting social tolerance closer to ecological tolerance, and we're very far away from that in certain kinds of animals like brown bears. And then this is our kind of marginal case. So we're doing, I can't tell you much about this, it's quite an exciting project, but I can't really sort of announce its details yet. But we're working with, I was approached by a fantastic group of individuals who work in a kind of coral reef restoration community of practice, who are, again, value creation and decision making around corals. It's desperate. A lot of the people who are working in reef restoration have lived through 2-3 bleaching events. They have intimate knowledge of corals, but they also understand that where the choices are being made, you know, and where values are being created around what we're going to do with reefs and corals in the future, is not necessarily hearing from the human voices who have direct insight into corals, let alone the corals themselves, which are often kind of almost seen not as animals, or seen as a kind of a tool within biodiversity, for instance, or seen even as more like kind of forestry than as animals with complex life cycles and communicative abilities. So what does coral decision making and planning and the future for corals and coral reefs look like if we take the perspectives of corals and we include corals in our decision making arena? So we're working on a number of projects. I think we'll do a portfolio of work around corals, but that's a real passion project for me and really urgent. And then we have some other conversations on the horizon around estuarine crocodiles in Australia, maybe white ibis, and certainly with wolves. We're going to be focusing on wolves in North America at first, but I think a lot of these sorts of projects are probably going to be translatable elsewhere. So finally, to wrap up before questions, where does technology come into this? Well, something that I would love to hear back from people about today, and that is still very much in the development stage within our work, is building a kind of tech lab or a tech program, tech and industry program, that needs to come through partnerships with industry insiders. And why technology matters to the kind of questions of communication and inclusion are because we need to rely on technologies like that for, as I said, some of the science parts of preferences and interests and some of the knowledge claims. But we also have AI communication systems on the horizon. So what's that going to add to everything I've laid out for you? Is it going to, can it be used really powerfully? Is it going to assist in these kinds of reimaginings of how we govern our world and make decisions in our world? Will it enfranchise other living beings, or do we need to think about doing a kind of inclusive process in the AI communication space, for instance? How would the ideas about flourishing, or how would the models of communication systems and technologies shift if we did some of these kinds of perspective takings right at the point of design? We also need to think about measures for flourishing. So technologies are going to be key tools for markers of flourishing. But again, there are those hanging questions of whose flourishing matters the most. Technologies can have a role in creating immersive experiences, for instance, that may be a key part of how we get our imaginations into the right place to even attend to the interests and voices of others. So think about corals, for instance. They're underwater. Their voices, you need sort of technologies to pick out their communications. They're in a totally different kind of environment to us. So we have to rely on getting creative to bring their voices close to us in lots of different ways. And then there's the question of kind of multi-species inclusive regulation. This is something that's weighing on my head, in my mind a lot at the moment. Are the kinds of, all of the technologies that we're looking at the moment, are they going to, and in the background here is CRISPR, going back to this sort of genome editing, we have a range of very, very intrusive and sort of problem amplifying technologies. They also have really positive aspects to them if well governed and regulated and well directed. And if enough stakeholders are heard about and heard from and included in the design stage and the policymaking stage around these technologies. But we are in a new industrial revolution at the moment. And I think not enough of us are really grasping that. We have genomic and genetic engineering technologies that allow us to design at the point of the genome of an organism, and industrialize an organism at the point of the genome. We have new forms of synthetic intelligence that may enfranchise or disenfranchise us, may change what we perceive intelligence to be, may change our moral boundaries. Don't forget that a lot of our moral thresholds for things like rights are intelligence-based thresholds, are agency-based thresholds. How's that going to affect and warp and change, and in positive or negative ways, our moral baselines? And then how's this going to impact on other living beings? Are, for instance, AI communication systems going to get used only for good? Are they going to be well regulated because we think these other living beings matter and they deserve this kind of regulation? Could they be used in nefarious ways by hunters, by those who wish to exploit other living beings? We just don't know at the moment. And obviously, communication systems are diverse, but they're only one way of measuring interests and preferences as well. So getting that regulation question right is on my mind, and something that I would really like to partner with people on. And then inclusive processes and businesses and industry more widely. So that kind of speaks to what I was saying earlier, but we want to work with business and industry associates who might be willing to co-design with us some of these kind of inclusive and representative models to see how it changes the creativity, the goals and the outcomes of their businesses and their operating principles. So I don't know how long I've been talking to you all for, but that gives you, I hope, an overview of what we're working on, and I would now love to hear from all of you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk, Melanie. I'm sure our community has some questions for you about your ideas and your work. So we will open up the floor to comments and questions from the audience now. Just another reminder that you can post questions in the chat by selecting the chat icon and then typing in your question, or by raising your hand to speak on the call by selecting the react icon and then the raise hand function, so I know who to call upon. And also, please feel free, this is optional, but if you'd like to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your background or your interest before making your remarks, that's encouraged as well. I think we'll start with Carrie.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Melanie. I am so heartened listening to you. I had no idea the depth and the breadth that would be in this conversation. So thank you so much for all that you're doing and everybody that you're playing with. Avantika also put in the chat something that I was going to mention, and that is, are you aware of what some of the work the University of Saskatchewan is doing for intuitive interspecies communication? I was a presenter at that symposium, and while science doesn't really have a way to measure in our intuitive connection, I don't hear it spoken of, and perhaps that's why, but it is, to me, worth it to bring that word into the conversation, because it is what we do have in common as animals, is that energetic connection. And even though people can't measure, haven't figured out how to measure it, and that's what MJ Barrett's work is pointing toward, is how do we create methods for intuitive awareness. I think it's worth the discomfort to just keep the word intuitive in circulation. I was also, I love that you're talking about the way humans define intelligence as a very important thing to look at. That was the title of my presentation, was Redefining Intelligence, and I would love to connect with you about that. Yes, so I'm just going to circle around to a question about my contemplation is whether democracy is actually, like, looking for an interspecies democracy is actually the direction that we want to go. I wonder if nature, it has anything to do with democracy, or if perhaps we could look more for a harmonic model, going toward looking at music as a sort of a model, looking at how nature's not trying to say, okay, how many, do all the gazelles agree that we should run in this direction? There is a harmonic that individuals in nature and life respond to on a felt sense, looking at murmurations, looking at schooling fish. I don't know that there is a model in place right now other than perhaps geometry as a way to look at a harmonic model of governance. But these are the kinds of questions that I play with to facilitate humanity being more in touch with that part of ourselves, rather than asking, how do we make nature fit into our ability to measure? How can we develop our studies and our questions by becoming more aware of the part of us that is already harmonized with nature. And so I'm curious your thought about democracy and, you know, a democratic approach versus a harmonic approach. And I will pause there and look forward to connecting with you, writing to you and more directly. So thank you again for everything you're bringing to us.
My pleasure. And I'll pop my email down for folks to reach out to me if they want to. Oh no, that's not, I don't know what's happened there. But it's not going to let me do it because it's going to put other people's things in. I'll do it later. Thank you, Kerry. And yes, very much look forward to communicating with you. Lots in there. With the harmonic model, can I tease that out a little bit more? So are you is it kind of like, in some ways, finding a way for, is it quite an ecological idea that you're talking about there? So sort of trying to find it, because, you know, ultimately in nature, in the living world, there's lots of conflict and competition going on, but really a huge amount of the time, both within communities of organisms and also inter and intra species kind of clashes and challenges and interactions. And, you know, one of the problems that I think we're stuck on at the moment is that we need new thinking about ecology. Actually, we need to rethink entanglement, for instance. You know, entanglement's a really popular idea at the moment, but yes, living beings rely on one another and relate to one another, but they're processual, they're in constant state of change. Yes, you get these moments of stability in geological terms, but actually everything is in a dynamic state, and it's dynamic because living beings are agents, right? So they're constantly changing themselves inside and changing the world outside to enhance flourishing, and it doesn't always work out so well for other organisms, and things are constantly in change. So are you talking about trying to find new models, ecological models, that kind of get us to more of a kind of a state of harmony to a certain extent in our relations in any kind of given moment? Or is it partly about also trying to get, you know, because things are out of whack, there is no two ways about that. We, you know, with 4% of wild mammals left on the planet and 70% of them ones that are enslaved in one way or another, I know that's a harsh term to use, and God knows I live in rural communities and have done all my life. I understand everything, you know, that farmers face and go through, and they have my you know, love and sympathy. That said, you know, we have to look at the big picture, and the big picture is we have 70% of mammals whose lives are constrained, controlled, whose autonomy is constrained and controlled by us, and only 4% left who are living autonomous wild lives. That's a shocking reversal, and one that we all need to consider. And so we need some harmonizing in terms of human interests. But to speak to democracy, these are political questions, though. They remain political questions. There are philosophical questions here about, you know, if animals can communicate with us, if we recognize that they're agents, if we recognize they can define their own good inside their own bodies, they become not moral patients, but moral agents. And therefore they are owed some form of representation. Now, that's a kind of rights-based model, although most rights-based models have a threshold within biology that not everybody necessarily is comfortable with. So they make assumptions about intelligence, for instance, or sentience, even as kind of certain kinds of thresholds for your interests mattering. Not everybody is going to want to sign up to that model. But political models are more about who's in the community, whose voices they've marginalized, whose interests are marginalized, and for a process to be regarded as just, and for a system to be regarded as just, they should be heard from. And so I do think that remains an important part of the dimension, but I agree with you that I think we need very different models of ecology. Is that okay as a kind of starting answer, Kerry? We can carry on offline.
Yes, absolutely. And yes, I agree with you. It's about a different way of relating to ecology, a different way relating to humanity and politics, to recognize that humanity is really the only species interested in politics. And it's important just because of the domination. But yes, going forward and having the experience of a different way to relate to ecology might change the way we relate to our data, might change the way we relate to other species, might change the way we relate to one another. And that's where my heart is. So yes, we can continue offline, but thank you so much. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Avantika?
Hello. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. I'm just walking my dogs, so the timing just landed this way.
Very
I hope you'll be able
appropriately.
to hear me okay. Yeah, I just wanted to, like Carrie said, ask you and bring your attention to the work that's happening at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm doing a research fellowship there right now, and we're looking at, and so I've been working with Dr. MJ Barrett for the last 4 years, and we just had our second symposium last year looking entirely at intuitive interspecies communication as a way to communicate with animals who, we believe are conscious, intelligent, and communicative. And through the symposium, actually, many amazing things emerged, including a group of artists who are either emerging artists or artist researchers, or who are established artists who are meeting, they call themselves artists using multi-species communication. There are graduate students who are meeting now regularly. That includes myself. And so a lot of interesting things that have emerged from there, and a lot of places to go from here. And yeah, I would love to connect with you afterwards. I think there was a lot of resonance in what you shared and what we're working on, and personally where I want to go with this research. So yeah, wasn't sure if you had heard of Dr. MJ Barrett, but I think her work
I
could
have,
be.
I have heard of, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so
but I haven't had a conversation, and actually hearing you, I mean, partly because we're just at the early stages of we're building out kind of what the academic program would look like, and looking at where we need to build or build partnerships with. But we are very, very keen to build partnerships with other universities and research groups. And this area of what, the science, the inclusive science, and also in your case, actually really looking at what communication is and what communication could and should look like. It would be really fantastic to have a conversation. So yes.
Yeah, I think so. So I will keep it short, but I really look forward to connecting with you. And hi, Carrie, it's nice to see you on here. And really nice to it's inspiring the work that you're doing, and I'm totally on board and on the same track. And yeah, so I look forward to connecting with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Josh. We lost you for a second. Yeah.
First off, thank you so much for the work. Thank you so much to Interspecies Internet for, making this more broadly available. I love what you guys are doing. I've got a series of questions. I don't expect you to answer all of them, but I just kind of want to throw them out to seed potential future conversations. And by the way, Melanie, thank you for responding to my email when you and I just exchanged emails. I appreciate that. Several thoughts came to mind, so forgive me for them being less than articulate. First off, one question I had was, of the people who are doing this project, how many of them, or it's not about counting numbers, but how do you make sure some of the Indigenous perspectives are involved? Because of course, it's not all cultures that have had this problem. It's more ours, right? So the concept of two-eyed seeing, which we work with a lot in ours, seems very relevant here. And so that's one question. A second kind of related question, in the healthcare field where I used to work, they had this concept of OCAP, which is ownership, control, access, and possession of stories. And I wonder about this a lot when it comes to technology capturing story, and how do we know those stories don't get weaponized or misused? So that's a second related area. The other two, and I apologize, I hope I'm not taking up too much time. The others are, how do we move from, it feels to me like one of the most fundamental shifts that we're actually trying to achieve is moving from this belief that we as humans are outside of, quote, nature, unquote. And so that's sort of the stuff that I referenced in the email that we're trying to do, but boy, is it tough. And that actually I see as very related to moving from, and I guess this is what Carrie is speaking of, the concept of everything as nouns and individual and atomized, as opposed to relationships and verbs. There's a concept there that I found at least interesting, and by the way, at least here in Ontario, where I am, many of the Indigenous languages are verb-based. So the vast majority of, rather than noun-based. And I think that has something. And then finally, I do have to share something that an informal experiment I've been doing for a long time, which is I've been asking people, if you could have a translator that would tell you what your pet was thinking, would you want it? And I will tell you, the vast majority of people say no. And they say no for one of two reasons. Either because they believe they already know what their pet wants, and we already have good communication, or, and this is the more common, I don't want to know, they're just going to complain. And as we move into potentially, if we are in fact, a liminal space where change is happening quicker and quicker, and for many people, scarcity will become more and more of an issue, that kind of fear and anxiety doesn't tend to open people's hearts. It tends to close their ears. And so I think about that also, and sorry, and then last but not least is, and this is kind of also related, is there's, from your presentation, which I know you guys are just starting, so please don't take this as any kind of a criticism, but there seemed to be a focus on charismatic species as having them in the room. And what I would postulate that it has to be broader than that, because we'll be missing too many stories. Again, I'm sure you've thought through all of this stuff. No disrespect intended, of course. Thank you.
No, none taken in the vote. And one has to take criticism anyway. It's incredibly important. There's absolutely nothing wrong with criticism. And good God, if we weren't going to be willing to do that, we'd be in trouble. I will do my best, Josh. You've asked a lot. We're in communication, so I can talk to you offline. But Indigenous perspectives, firstly, very important, and I can't do justice to an answer properly here. But I can say that I can say for starters that several of our projects are working both with Indigenous communities and will involve co-design. And there's one that I haven't discussed, but that's in the pipeline that is going to be Indigenous led. So we are doing work with Indigenous communities, of course. I mean, I should say, and I speak for myself as an individual, that I think you are right that broadly in non-Western industrialized societies, this listening to and attending to and including other living beings, certainly within kinship models, for instance, in ancestor models, is and also in governance, kind of community governance models, is normal within many of these smaller societies. But that also places an enormous burden on a lot of Indigenous communities at the moment, because people from the West are like, well, we'll take your intelligence and knowledge and systems and like plug them into our disaster. And that's not fair, and that's not reasonable. I think it has to be Indigenous led. It has to be led by by those communities, and I am wary of kind of plug and play approaches to taking culture out of its context and plonking it somewhere else and doing a disservice to those communities in there. But there's also a question of marginalization of human voices within every single project that we talk.
Sorry.
Look what
Oh, I
put
know.
in the
I was
oven.
going to have them. Yes.
Oh, don't know what happened there, but yeah. So what we are believing is that the marginalized human voices matter alongside the and it not just marginalized, just most people feel disenfranchised in their political systems today. So making sure in our work that the human communities are fairly sorted, that they're fairly represented, that they're heard from, and that we have a duty of care to their stories is also a key dimension of our work. So that's my kind of very, very quick answer to that. Stories and images, I that's a huge one actually. And I have a colleague who's come from natural history filmmaking actually, but very concerned about image use as well and how we get that right. I think that's a huge question. I'm not directly working on that, but very keen to hear from anybody who is, because it is, I think you're right to flag that. It's very important. What else did you ask? So outside, are we outside? So in my intellectual work, aside from this, so in How to Be Animal, for instance, also a little bit in my really early, not brilliant, but really early work in my 20s on extinction, which was kind of tracing the Anthropocene, I looked a lot at these sorts of questions. So and actually for me, I focused with How to Be Animal not just on the kind of inside outside nature dichotomy, but also so that kind, and that's a perspective problem. So we're talking a lot about perspective taking, but something really interesting about kind of how rock art shifted as we sort of transitioned from being hunter-gatherers into farmers is that you can physically see a kind of perspective shift. You can see a kind of hierarchical perspective shift taking place. And I think, when we are in patterns of exploitation or in conditions of unequal power, you will get perspective problems. And those perspective problems cash out in our art, they cash out in our language, they cash out in our legal, political governance structures, our power structures, and so forth. So yes, there is something very important to be done to recognize that we are a part of nature, that was always a delusion on the part of the systems that it suited and the power structures that it suited. That said, we're never going to completely fit back in the way that I wouldn't even want to say when human beings were fully integrated in quite the same way. We have peeled off a little bit away from, and our moral systems are a positive outcome from that, but we have kind of peeled away behaviorally from the rest of the living world. And it means that on the one hand, it's important to get the perspective that we are part of nature, right? And that we are still integrated, whether we like it or not, but also to recognize that we do still need novel approaches to deal with the fact that human beings are disruptive in profound and unusual ways that can't be quite captured in too easy a kind of let's just be part of nature again kind of narrative. And similarly, we have a problem that we don't think that we're animals at some level. Our belief systems are based on this idea that like our intelligence is some kind of bizarre, separable, special part of us that is not in fact part of our bodies, that is not animal, it can be uploaded in a machine and is the most important part of us and is what gives us our completely unique and sole moral status among living beings. We got a whole bunch of delusions that are embedded in our legal and moral systems that do need challenging, but they need challenging in subtle and kind of important way, in careful intellectual ways. The nouns, the questions. So yes, there's so much to go into on that, but again, with nature, it just will not let us go at this with simplicity, because yes, we're all interrelated, but will a relational model do the trick? Not quite. Even a mother and her kin are at some level in competition with one another. Animals will abandon offspring if the energy doesn't play out. You know, we are always in a complex relationship, but also we are autonomous reproductive individuals if we're that kind of organism. It's not one size fits all in the living world, and we need both those aggregate kind of models and those relational models, but we still also need to pay attention to individuals, because otherwise you risk flattening the rights and interests of living beings. And also within organisms, we've got such a tendency to think, oh, this is what tigers want. This is what tiger flourishing looks like. But tigers are individuals, you know, they don't, you know, one tiger is not the same as the next tiger. So, and you know, we have to be very, very careful about how we understand biology and how we understand the living world. And I think we just have to accept that this is why conversation and enfranchisement and lots of different voices and critical thought is so crucial, because none of this is easy. And none of us is straightforward, and it will be imperfect, and we need multiple tools for it to be successful. I've given a super long answer, but you did ask me a whole ton of questions, but I hope that's been a little way forward, Josh. Maisie, you've been patiently waiting. I'm so sorry.
No, not at all. In fact, Josh asked one of my questions, so it was fine. I had a question about Indigenous knowledges too, which has been broadly answered by yourself. Thank you so much for a really, really fascinating talk. So I'm a lecturer in sociology at the University of Manchester in the UK. And I study animal behaviour experts. So I study the people who study the animals, if you like.
Oh, nice.
So people who are using both traditional sort of quantitative measurements in behavioural studies, but also people who are using not necessarily intuitive in the way that Kerry was talking about, but people who are using qualitative methods. So critical anthropomorphism, you know, in profoundly embodied methods of attunement and attention and so on and so forth. So I was really, really interested in some of the work that's being done around inclusive science, and also really interested and profoundly grateful to hear a cautioning voice about the kind of excited drive towards AI, and actually how those technologies can also be a force for greater exploitation, as well as a force for good. Yeah. So enough about me. I have a really quite a broad and simple question, since Josh has asked my more sociological question, but really it's around the aims of CERSI. So there have been other projects around the representation of animals, the political representation of animals before, animal commissioners and so on and so forth. I'm sure, and indeed I know, some of the people you're working with have already worked on those kinds of systems. So how is CERSI, how is Animals in the Room different? What have you learned from what's gone before? And what is the place that you are trying to get to, and why do you think you can get there? Is it because of the range of people that you're working with, the size of the project, the scale of it? You know, what is it for you that's going to really make this difference?
No, that was a great question, and I would really like to connect with your work. Actually, that's like, yes, that we don't have anyone doing that kind of thing, and that's really important. So I would be very keen to speak to you afterwards. The truthful and honest answer to that, and the one that I think is necessary, is that we cannot promise to be the right people to do this. We cannot promise to get it right. And our approach to mitigate that risk to what is necessarily experimental, and you're completely right. Look at the non-human rights project, for example. There's a project that had so much passion and heart. Obviously, Stephen Wise recently passed, but so much passion and heart behind it, huge amounts of rigorous thought and approaches. It's super tough. It is really, you know, it's difficult to to get things to stick. And actually a lot of work has generally been theoretical. So certainly around kind of multi-species representation has tended to be up to now, and kind of political representation has tended to be slightly more theoretical than kind of actually, certainly in larger scale sense, being kind of trialed in you know, the proof of the pudding kind of situations where you really see, well, it's a great idea, but what does it look like in practice, and does anything good come out of it? So my honest answer is we can't make those kinds of promises, but I can tell you what we're doing to try and mitigate. So, and what we've learned. So the first is, and that's part of what you've probably been hearing as a repeated theme, or please can I speak to you afterwards. The part of it is to make sure that our knowledge base and our expertise and our approaches are diverse and are decentralized and are not any one person's kind of philosophy, not any one person's kind of career pathway, that this is a very collaborative, very rich approach that you know, listens just within the human community to lots of different kinds of knowledge and expertise in different kinds of places, in different kinds of locations, so that the power is a little bit decent. Because, you know, anybody who works in an academic environment, or in fact a charity, knows that power structures really impact what's going on in those spaces. Certain kinds of people are more vocal than others, they dominate conversations, etc., etc., etc. We want to, as a group, really try to move beyond that, to make sure that we are very diverse and that we are integrating as many and collaborating with as many partners as possible. And that is, it's, you know, we got to have some sort of leadership in place. I mean, and that's all I've tried to do. Believe me, I tried on an environmental philosophy project, kind of going for a totally mycelial approach and having no leadership, and it didn't work, I have to admit. So we've got to have some leadership, but I think our model is one of partnerships. It is a partnership project, this one. Of course, it's also in partnership with other living beings. We have to always make sure that we take off the human goggles, and as much as possible, we keep checking back in with what this looks like for us. You know, have we come too far away again and completely lost sight of what it actually means to be a salamander, what it means to be oh, I didn't answer that question about charismatic animals, actually. That was a very important criticism. Before I close, I'm going to answer that. So that's one thing that we're trying to do, is mitigate through diversity and decentralization of kind of power within the team. The other is to go in with a principle of experimentation. As I kind of repeated elsewhere, we have to be experimental about inclusion. We just don't know yet what the best model is. So I can't say to you, we're definitely going to be the ones who are going to get it right. What we're going to try to do is build an evidence base. So what we are going to try to do as best as we can is see what works and doesn't work, see how we're interpreting what working and doesn't working means, keep on doing these kind of meta layers of evaluation, evaluate the heck out of the whole thing, and slowly, through bringing publics along with us, that's not something we've spoken about, but it's really important for me. You know, I'm all about public engagement. You have to use inclusive language. You can't use language that ignores half of the population or turns like a bunch of people off. You have to talk to people in terms that they can understand and that they can relate to, and feel that they are also an important part of this conversation. And we do need to bring human communities along with us. So that's what we're trying to do. And so it's, you know, in short answer, it's about diversity, and it's about really pushing for an evaluated process and moving slowly and cautiously towards evidence-based frameworks or insights. We might not even end up at a framework, insights.
I really like that answer. Thank you.
So we have like only a few minutes, but I do want to answer that charismatic question because it was a good criticism and it's an important one. And it is one, unsurprisingly, I should imagine. I don't know if Josh is still here, but for everyone else, it is one that we worry about. The reason it's skewed at the moment, and I do not want it to remain skewed. And again, if anyone is doing a project and wants to collaborate with us, that is in a totally different kind of with the unsung and the forgotten from the living world, then I would be very interested in doing that. The reason that we are focusing on, and I should say those aren't all the organisms that we're working with, we are actually working with some less quote unquote kind of mega charismatic organisms. But we have tried initially to not impose our ideas onto the world, but to allow communities to kind of come to us and for there to be a bit of a mandate for the work in the first trials. These are the ones in most cases where, excuse me, sorry, a bit of a COVID cough. These are the ones that have initially, not all of them, but a number of those came from communities, so from conservation NGO partners, from animal welfare, or specifically in another case from a community. So we've actually, what we're probably seeing there is not something that we've designed, actually. It's just those are hot point conflict issues at the moment, or kind of critical issues. You know, corals are in a desperate state, so it's not altogether surprising that perhaps that's one that has, where they've reached to us and pulled us through. And same with bears, you know, same with wolves. These are animals where it's probably not surprising that those are the ones that have kind of floated to the surface immediately, but it is a very important question, and actually to understand properly how to do representation, we need a very diverse, sometimes we need to look at more broadly at ecologies anyway, and but also we need to look at lots of different kinds of organisms in different kinds of contexts. And I think we're kind of running out of time, but brilliant questions.
Yeah, we have we're close to the end. I was hoping to ask a really quick question just to close things off. If you're willing to hear it, Melanie.
When I've missed all the brilliant chat, can someone save the chat for me and send it through?
Yeah, absolutely. Quickly before we wrap up, I was just curious, you know, given your background and your current work experience bioethics, I'm sure you're already familiar with this idea, but you know, there's arguably this widespread notion that it's erroneous to think that there's any overlap between the ethical domain and the natural world, right? So some ways that this has been expressed have been through the notion of the naturalistic fallacy. So arguing that something that if something is natural, it must be good, or the is-ought fallacy, you know, sort of inferring what ought to be done from what is. And this isn't, you know, what you're doing exactly with CIRC or AIR, which, you know, seems certainly more complex and bidirectional. But this paradigm of thinking about ethics, to me, seems to sort of underpin this idea that there is no normative dimension in the natural world at all, right? And that ethics is solely the product of, or only belongs to the human discursive or cognitive domain. So I'm just curious sort of, you know, about your motivations. How do you see your work challenging this idea? You know, does it interface with it at all? You know, just, yeah, could you speak a little bit to the relationship between that and your approach with CIRC and AIR?
So just going to throw right at the end, Cristian, classic philosopher of biology, just going to throw us like a huge philosophical question just to round out. No, it's a brilliant comment. And actually, again, it's separate to this in my kind of intellectual work, that's a lot of my kind of, I guess, bread and butter is thinking through things like the naturalistic fallacy, like what is that journey from, because I'm a moral naturalist, you know, I think I'm not someone, and actually, oh, there's a lot to answer. This is a huge question. So I'll give you an anecdote. I had a visiting fellowship in bioethics. I won't say who they were. Another big bioethics body, but not in my country. And we had kind of, you know, there was a really positive, but kind of tense conversation that took place about this real question, and because it's very present in bioethics. It's changing at the moment, and actually I'm the co-chair of the environment, climate and health stream within Nuffield Council at the moment. And one of the kind of things that we're having to do a huge amount of soul searching about for the first time really properly in Nuffield's history is what does a multi-species lens look like in questions of climate health and sustainability and bioethics. So that is a huge subject, and a lot of it comes, you know, it touches on questions of anthropocentrism and all of the other kind of dilemmas that we're trying to deal with right now. But within bioethics, traditionally bioethics has tended to be very human ethics centric, very anthropocentric in many ways. I don't want to necessarily make it pejorative. It's just part of its history and how the kind of field emerged. But it remains, I would say, pretty human focused. And so it's not surprising that in a situation like that, when you're talking to bioethicists, and this is going back quite a while now, I think the conversation would be different now, but this is like 10 years ago, that the assumption was that we don't, what has nature to tell us about bioethics? Nature is amoral, right? You know, nature is that morality is a human domain, and ethics are made by and for humans, and that when we try to blend with nature, that morality and our ethics kind of break down. For me, that's entirely the wrong way into the question. For me, I'm always first and foremost about the natural history question. So my question is, where did morality come from? Because we're animals, because we're organisms. So how do you go on a journey from a single cell organism to a human that's talking about ethics systems? Because for sure there wasn't a lightning bolt. For sure there wasn't like a bizarre genetic kind of flashpoint in our evolutionary history where suddenly we spoke overnight and drew and became yes, someone's speaking to the late Frans de Waal, who was someone who very, very focused on this and very much a kind of naturalist about ethics and morality. So I think we have to answer a difficult question, which is why are we moral, and what does it mean to be moral? And that isn't a straightforward question. And can we? It's convenient to separate us off and say, well, no, we're the only ones who talk about ethics, so we're the only ones who can be ethicists, and we're the only ones who ethics really relate to. Well, yes, but we're still eating other animals, we're chasing them, we're hunting them, we're pooping out entropy every day. We're still, you know, we haven't somehow become not animals or not entangled with the rest of the living world. These sorts of things are these desires to separate the human moral system in a clean way are things just to make the model work. They have nothing to do with reality. In reality, our moral systems are profoundly impacted by our bodies. They're impacted by their neuroendocrine systems. They're impacted by our gut microbiome. They're impacted by our relations, our theory of mind, our social cognition, how many of us there are in our community, the pathogen load in our society. They are affected by so much that is natural, that is amoral, that is competitive, that is complex. And that's why we don't get it we don't get it right with one another, let alone with anyone else, because it is not a clean logical system shored off from the rest of nature. So yeah, I push back at that notion of morality anyway, but also to answer just very simply, just because you are the moral agent does not, by logic, limit moral subjecthood. And that's the mistake for me. It is simply a convenience and for an exploitative organism who's built a moral system that we want to put a hard line at where moral subjecthood is. But there is no reason that just because the swallow, the gorgeous swallow outside of my room is chitter-chattering their blooming head off as I speak, just because that swallow has no interest in the human ethical system, is not going to contribute to the polis or the social contract, does not mean they should not be represented, heard and included, because they are an autonomous agent and what we do affects them. So they still have moral subjectivity, they can still be included and heard. And that's my kind of off the cuff pushback on the naturalistic fallacy. But great question, Cristian, of course.
Yeah, very much for taking the time to answer it. Yeah, so I guess we should wrap up. Thank you once again, Melanie, for your generosity and for taking the time to join us today with such an inspiring talk. And thanks to the community for attending and engaging with Melanie's work. If you'd like to stay up to date with Melanie's work online, you can visit the following links, which I will post in the chat right now. So they're in there. The Melanie Challenger's personal website, LinkedIn, and the domain for Animals in the Room. So once again, on behalf of the whole organization, the trustees, and our community, thank you for joining us. And have a wonderful weekend. And we'll see you all in about a month's time for another exciting talk.
Yeah, lovely to meet everyone. Thank you very much.